Hello, and welcome to episode 15 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And this is Jon Dinning in Los Angeles.
And we're pleased to speak with you tonight about the digital writing sample.
Speak for yourself.
You're not excited about talking some writing sample?
We've had more, I think, enjoyable conversations, put it that way.
Well, there's a lot of uncertainty about it these days, so I think it's actually a good thing to talk about. And as you might imagine, with the literary theme on tap, we have gone with some literary choices. So first off, Jon, what are you drinking tonight?
Yeah, so I went back and forth trying to pair an appropriate drink to authors that I like. My first instinct was obviously just pure absinthe for Oscar Wilde, but I thought this would fall apart in about 20 minutes. So instead, I'm doing an old Christopher Hitchens classic, Johnny Walker Black, scotch and soda.
Nice. You and I have actually had absinthe real absinthe in a bar in Amsterdam, have we not?
Proper Wormwood, under the street, out of our minds absinthe, yeah.
It's strong. That's the easiest thing I will say.
Yeah, that's the real deal.
Yeah, and I am actually drinking a mojito in honor of Ernest Hemingway. Not necessarily my favorite author, not by a long shot, but I really like this drink, so I think it's a pretty good call overall.
Yeah, love him or hate him, his prose, I get, debatable, but his affinity for a cocktail, unimpeachable.
And his ability to hold his own in a bar fight also.
Oh my God, yeah.
I will say this, though, about Hemingway, is that it's purported that when he would write, if he got through a page a day, he'd be extremely satisfied with writing a single page, and he would edit it and re-edit it. And we're not going to be able to do that in the writing sample for the LSAT, but it is an interesting standard to think about when somebody's like, I finished a single page of a book today.
Yeah.
And they look at that as a really significant achievement. I think that says something.
One of my favorite Hemingway quotes about writing, unfortunately, has no applicability to the writing sample. So digest this and then lose it. But he used to say, always write drunk, but edit sober. And I thought that was great. So he'd booze and create, but then come back with a clear head and make sure that he, knew what he was talking about.
I wrote the LSAT Bible's in the reverse, though.
Drunken editing?
I was writing sober, and then I just made sure to just drink heavily while editing it. It's like, I can't read what I've written again. This is horrible.
Yeah, I drank heavily while reading them, so...
Indeed. And of course, as you might imagine, when we were choosing songs for this, we've gone with maybe the most famous of all writing songs, and that is a song by the Beatles, and that is Paperback Writer. So I think we've hit all the high points of literary finesse here.
So far, so good. I love that tune. I love our drinks. So much do I love, in fact, your drink, that I've been in Hemingway's favorite haunt down in Havana, which is famous for his mojitos, basically. A place called the Bodeguita, I think. Bodeguita.
You're like a world traveler with this. You're just in Mexico City. Now, I know you've been in Havana before, because I remember when you went to Cuba.
Yes. That's
impressive.
It was a good trip. And Hemingway helped. So we'll see if he does us some favors tonight, too. What else has been going on? We got some cocktails. We got a good song.
Not a whole lot. It's been an interesting week. We'll get to the LSAT world in a moment, but obviously the big news in kind of like the college world is that you had the guy who was the commencement speaker at Morehouse decide that he was going to offer to pay off everybody's debt for the graduating class.
That's right. Yeah, 400 students. I think somewhere I read it was going to come to about $40 million. Robert F. Smith, billionaire, entrepreneur, and obviously all-around hero.
Pretty generous.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. So 400 people got a surprise bit of charity.
It's like that Oprah episode where she's like, you get a car.
Yeah, look under your seats.
Yeah, now you get no debt. I will say this, though. The problem that this raises to me is, if you graduated last year from Morehouse, you clearly are sitting there thinking to yourself, what the hell?
Yeah.
And next year, now you're like, will I get lucky again? It's such a small patch for what is a really big problem that I hope that it doesn't take away the emphasis on addressing the student debt problem.
Right. Yeah, this is more of a Band-Aid than a curative, but...
It's not even a Band-Aid, it's a thread.
Fair enough. A single stitch.
Over a huge wound.
Well, I have been reading a lot of comments from people on it about, what's this going to do to catalyze or mobilize? And a lot of really powerful, rich people doing commencement speeches right now. It's that time of year. You think anybody else is going to jump on this bandwagon? There's got to be a sense of peer pressure.
I don't know. Don't you feel like you'd look like a copycat if that's what you did?
Or a cheap bastard if that's what you didn't.
I mean, if you're Bill Gates level money, then, I think the pressure is a little bit greater. But then now it's a game of one-upsmanship. I got to do 1,000-person graduating class.
I wouldn't be sad to see it.
No.
But you're right, it's a tricky slope.
Yeah, and then the expectations and literally the fact that if you missed it by a year, I'd be kind of pissed off.
Yeah, I don't know who spoke at Morehouse last year, but don't you know he feels like an ass?
Those people who graduated from Morehouse are like, come on. I should have delayed.
I know.
Anyway, let's move on to the LSAT world. Sure. What's been going on there?
Again, not a whole lot here. I mean, we're gearing up to test day, obviously, in about 2 weeks or so. So things naturally seem to kind of hit a lull. But there have been a few blogs on that law:fully site that they've created.
Yes.
Nothing earth-shattering here.
No, actually 3 blogs in a matter of 5 days, which is, I think, pretty high output. Yeah. But again, none of this really relates to the test itself. It's mostly about equality, accessibility, diversity. And because of that, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. It's there if you want to go read it. Certainly, you know where to find it. Let's move to the topic of the night, though, which is the writing sample. And we're going to focus on the digital formatting of the writing sample by and large. But I do think it is useful to, at times, contrast it to the old style, which was the written sample that occurred at the end of the LSAT. So let's open it up and kind of break this down. First off, by talking about what the sample is, why it's there, some of the details of it, then talk about how the digital platform actually works. And then last, we'll talk about some tips about how to actually write it.
Sure.
We're not going to go incredibly in depth because I don't want to be here for 2 hours talking about the nuances of, the third sentence of the decision. But we'll give some general pointers about how this works. In that way, everybody at least will be on the same page.
Sure.
So, Jon, start us off, man. What is the digital writing sample?
Yeah, I guess the place to start is just the broad context of an LSAT essay in general. What is it? Why is it there? So the way that this roughly has worked and still in a sense works is at the conclusion of each LSAT, which is all multiple choice questions, your score out of 180 is built around your A through E Scantron abilities, as anyone knows. There was an additional essay that was tacked on, almost it felt like an afterthought, 35 minutes. We'll talk again about the format and various things, but there was this personal, at the time, handwritten essay that you had to complete at the end of each LSAT for them to score your test. So it was this strange hurdle point that you had to get past. But I think the objectives of it have been forever a little mysterious. And they still are a little bit. So one of the questions that I always ask and still kind of ponder, why is LSAC included on the LSAT, an essay in general? What are they trying to accomplish with an essay itself? And I ask that to you. Me? I mean, I have thoughts. I'm sure we both do.
Well, I think there's multiple. Obviously, one of the things that they want to see is, all right, you're tired, you're a little bit under pressure, and given what you're asked to do in this essay, which we'll get to in a second, they want to see how well you can write. When you're put on the point of a sword, to some extent, how good are you?
Right.
How do you express yourself? And also that then allows colleges to do some comparisons. They can see what you've written versus what your personal statement looks like.
Sure.
Is it the same voice? Is it even the same, remote writing style? And this is really useful when they're kind of, checking legitimacy of applications and things of that nature. But the problem is obviously it's not a huge part of the process. And for many people, it's felt like a waste.
Which we'll talk about. I think there's a lot of uncertainty about whether schools use this at all. We'll get to that in a second. My suspicion in some of this too, Dave, has been the optics of just the competitive landscape for LSAC. You take some of the other big grad school tests, and they all have essays on them. The GRE does. The GMAT does. Things you do in high school, SAT and ACT, they have essays typically. So I think LSAC almost felt like the odd man out not having something here. What's different about this, as we'll discuss, is no score is given. There is no quantification of how good or bad your essay is.
Which differs from these other tests that you're mentioning.
Yeah, all of these other tests score the essays that you write.
One of the things about the optics is you have to realize the writing sample has been around on this test for ages. Mm-hmm. And I think there certainly would have been a reasonable point where people said, get rid of it. It's not that useful. It's just extra time, money, and effort. And I think when you talk about the optics of it, getting rid of it became a problem because, well, now everybody else has moved into the scored writing section and things of that nature. So they've had it forever, but I think at that point, it kind of just carries on. It's just rolling through because, well, it's been there and now we can't get rid of it because everyone else has one. What are we going to do?
Right.
And so they needed to make some changes to it, which they have, to minimize the burden of it, really, because I've always found it to just be not helpful. That's my diplomatic way of saying I don't like it.
It's like the permanence of tradition, which is a stupid reason to ever do anything, frankly.
Yeah. So we know it's unscored. What happens, though? You send it. Every single school that you apply to gets a copy of the writing sample. Right. And these days, it's a copy of your last 3 writing samples. But in the past, every time you did a writing sample, the school got it. Do schools care about that? That was the first question that people would ask.
Yeah, and I still get asked this question all the time when this topic comes up. I'm sure people listening are wondering. And the answer is not really, but it depends school to school. There are some schools who certainly are going to prioritize it more than others. There are some schools who almost entirely will ignore it.
Yeah. I think when you get into the top level schools, they're seeing examples of your background, your grades, your history, your scores. They're pretty confident that from an intellectual standpoint, you have the capabilities. They're going to look at your personal statement. The writing sample isn't going to play much of a role.
Right.
They might look at it occasionally. You never know when somebody walks into the office at 8 a.m., they're reading... They're drinking some coffee and they look down and they're like, I'm going to read this, see what they wrote. Were they team kitchen renovation or did they go for a different renovation on the house? And so that's when you can actually see it play a role. And that's why I always tell people, take it seriously. Sure. Do the best that you possibly can, because if for some reason someone decided to read your writing sample, you want to at least have delivered something of high quality. Now, the counterpoint to the idea of the top schools not looking at it that often is, I think that as you go down the rankings, and we'll just use those as kind of a reference point here, I think the schools that kind of go towards the middle and the lower sides of the rankings, I think they look at it more.
I do too.
They're double checking their candidates, and sometimes they look at a candidate, they're not really certain. They're like, well, let's see how they performed when they were tired, when they were under pressure. And if they see something that is a quality product, they're like, all right, maybe that confirms what I thought. And if they see something that is awful, perhaps their response is, that calls you further into question.
For sure. Yeah, I always tell people there's maybe 2 or 3 instances of candidates who are likely to get scrutinized more heavily. People with English as a second language applicants. Sure. They want to make sure, again, that you can do this off the cuff, extemporaneously, especially with fatigue as a factor. People who've got some sort of weird undergraduate English results. So let's say you walk out of some school with a 3.6, but you got D's in all of your English lit classes. I want to read what you've written. Can this person effectively communicate? Because the transcript suggests maybe not. And then I think marginal candidates, people who maybe are just right on the fence and they're trying to make decisions at the very end of the line of soft credentials. This is where that lives.
Well, especially, let's say a school has said to you, hey, I need you to get a 148 to get in. And you've gone out there and you've gotten, say, a 146 or 147, and they're really trying to get you into the school, but they're struggling to kind of come up with justifications. Maybe they read something and they're like, this is actually really well done. It's well thought out. It's well executed. It's got a high degree of eloquence for a 30-minute essay or 35-minute essay. That could be something where they give you a little extra check. And I think more often than not, the writing sample would cause people problems, but there are occasions when it can actually be a confirmatory piece of evidence.
Sure, it can be redemptive, although I think in the vast majority of instances, it's more of a threat than a salvation.
Redemptive is a very strong word, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Redemption is like, hey, I brought you back from the dead. I'm like, I don't know if I would
How'd you get into Columbia, bro? You should see my writing sample.
My writing sample killed it at Harvard. So the key point of all that, though, is that you want to do your best. You don't want to just blow it off because, as the case may be, if someone decides to look at it, it could be determinative, and you don't want to leave your fate in the hands of the writing sample. That would be a sad outcome.
The opportunity for them to read it is there. Don't blow that potential opportunity. Again, it's probably not going to be the cornerstone of your acceptance.
Exactly.
But it could really do some harms if you don't take it seriously, if you blow it off. And frankly, if you don't do it at all, LSAC reserves the right not to score your test.
Yes, an incredibly important point to have been made. And of course, now we have a situation where you're going to be put in front of a computer writing this. Mm-hmm. And I think that's great. I love the changes that they're making with this. I hope it goes off technically without a hitch, but I don't necessarily... I don't dislike what they're actually doing. I love the fact that we don't have to do this all the time anymore. Yeah. And so let's talk about some of the mechanics of how the writing sample is working at this point. And at the time of this podcast, they are just about to launch their new program, but this is going to apply for everything post June of 2019. And so the key thing here is that starting with this
LSAT, by the way.
Yeah, inclusive. Starting with this LSAT, you will not be taking the writing sample at the end of the test. And this breaks a tradition that goes back decades at this point. So all prior test takers have gotten to the end of the LSAT and they're like, here we go. Now I have to turn my test booklet in, turn my answer sheet in. I have to sit here and wait while they hand out another paper test booklet. Then I'm going to write this. Then I'm going to have a little copy of it, which is ridiculous. That's all done with now. Yeah. Now it is separate from test day, and you can take it the same day if you want. You can come home and be like, geez, the writing sample seems like just the thing to do. Or you can take it a couple days later, or even weeks, months later.
Sure. Yeah, honestly, this is going to shrink test day for people by, I'd say, at least 45 minutes. And if that doesn't make you want to buy a cake and some confetti, I don't know what would. That's a great, that alone is sufficient for me to be like, I'm glad they're doing this.
Yeah, you can take it up to a year later, and as the makers of the test say, you can now complete the writing sample at a convenient time and place of your choosing. Mm-hmm. So that means for most people, they would be taking it at home on their computer, whether that's like a laptop or a desktop, what have you. You are going to sit down in front of a computer, which means no more writing. And in the past, you used a pen to kind of write through this. And if you made a mistake because there was a carbon copy underneath, you had to kind of like scratch through it. Writing samples would come out looking messy. And especially if someone was tired or not thinking clearly, there'd be these huge marked out sections. Sure. That's gone. It's now typed. You can correct what you've written. And that is such a big benefit. We're going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later here, but that is I think one of the greatest advantages. You can write more quickly and you can correct yourself as you go along, which is you couldn't do previously.
Yeah, I think not everyone is as maybe keyboard savvy as others, but the ability to just type this thing out is beautiful.
I think there's another huge benefit is in the past, people took it after every single LSAT and they had no choice. Yeah. You had to do it. That is no longer the case. If you have one writing sample on file, you're good to go. Mm-hmm. So you can take it more. Like if you went out and you did the writing sample in June and you're like, man, I just didn't really execute. I should not have chosen that option. I should have chosen the other option. You can take it again later.
Right.
I don't know that anyone needs to feel that strongly about it.
Yeah, it's been a long time since I saw somebody with a writing sample regret. Like, I chose poorly. We'll talk more about the choices and stuff involved at the end of this. But for the most part, if you do even a mediocre job here, you're done. And that's retroactive, which is great as well. So if you're listening to this having taken the test in the last 4 years or so, you already have a writing sample on your record. You're covered.
You're done.
You don't have to do another one.
Yeah. And it's not being presented to you at the end of the test anyway.
Right.
It's a separate thing. So they would be like, you're already good unless you want to take it, which is your option. It also means that because it's not all being given on the same day, the prompts change for people.
Yeah, which is really interesting to me. This is one of the unexpected developments, at least again in my eyes. what advantage would people really get knowing the prompts in advance from their friends or neighbors or something?
I think they do get an advantage because if you had a friend who took it on a Monday and they came back and they said, this is the decision that you have to make. Here's all the details. Here's some of the things I wrote. You are already a couple of minutes ahead and you have the opportunity to formulate some ideas. Now, is that the biggest advantage in the world? No, but it still is an advantage.
Yeah.
And I would argue that that is something that they would not want to allow for people. So
that's
if you go in on a Monday,
especially if you've got like a Christopher Hitchens type in your orbit, you can be like, hey, buddy, what did you write? Here's $20, you know?
Well, just imagine somebody went on our LSAT forum and was like, hey, I was thinking about this question, and they didn't, somehow they masked it and we didn't realize it was a writing sample. And all of a sudden we're starting to break down some argument, and they're like, then they go out the next day and they just regurgitate a lot of that for their writing sample.
All right, fair point. So what LSAC is doing preventatively for this is apparently it's a question bank of sorts, or a topic bank of sorts. When you take the test, you just spin a wheel, figuratively, and whatever comes up, that's your topic, that's your prompt.
Yes.
Which is a little bit of a bummer because people would form these weird like alliances and stuff. You'd get team this and team that on our forum and online and stuff after each test.
People would always come out and be like, I was team kitchen renovation.
Right.
And, some other people would be like, not me, I was team air conditioning or whatever the choices
team extra
were.
Bedroom.
I was team pool.
Yeah, which is one of the more fun and sometimes lively points of contention following a test.
And also benign because it had no score effect. It was really harmless. The thing about the way LSAC looks at this, and like I said, we'll look at how it's set up in a moment. They know that it's not that big of a deal. In years past, they've actually released large banks of the writing sample topics.
Yeah.
So you could go before a test and read like 30, 40, 50, 60 of them, and then they would choose one. And people used to ask me, should I read all of them and kind of like formulate the pros and cons and the argument? I'd be like, not unless you're incredibly bored and you want to waste your time.
Yeah.
Because they're all basically built around the same structure, the same fundamentals about the decision that you have to make. There's always going to be good and bad and so forth. And I was like, you spending your time on that is not at all useful, number one, but not nearly as useful as spending time on actual LSAT questions.
It's a little bit like parallel reasoning in the sense that the topic really changes but doesn't matter.
Structure is what we focus on. Parallel, same thing here.
Yeah.
You should be able to analyze any writing sample and do a pretty credible job. It doesn't matter. They don't change that much. Yeah. And there's always like, I could have gone that way or this way. And there's good things and bad things about it.
So if you've taken a test in the past several years and they're on your record for 5, so if you're in that window and you have a writing sample, you can be done with this thing. If you feel like you'd like to type one rather than having written one in the past, you have the option to do it. If you've never taken a writing sample, never taken an LSAT, you are going to have to do this once. But again,
that's exactly right.
Separate from the test, at home, typed out. What's this going to do to the speed of feedback or results?
Well, interestingly enough, they are saying that the processing time is somewhere between 1 and 3 weeks, although they believe that will typically be 1 week. Mm-hmm. And of course, I always think to myself, what processing? What are you doing to it?
Yeah, you're not scoring it.
It's like a Word document. I mean, fundamentally, you are transferring the Word document from this directory to this directory over here and attaching it. Okay, so it takes about a week to click a button or enter a keystroke. But that is what they're saying, and I think you can see why they're saying it would mostly be a week and not 3 weeks.
Yeah, so, there are some security measures and things that we'll discuss that are in place that are going to slow this down.
Let's talk about that because I actually think that the way that the new system works is useful enough to kind of like go through some of the details.
Sure.
So let's talk about that. We'll talk about the digital platform that they're using. And again, this is totally separate from the LSAT itself. Mm-hmm. So you can take this anywhere. You can do it at home. You can go someplace where, like a computer lab at your university if you don't have your own computer, these kinds of things.
Friend's house, parents' house, office.
Yeah. And this is what they say. They say you'll need access to a computer that runs Windows or Macintosh operating system. And you have to have a webcam. Okay, I won't even comment about that. You need to have a microphone.
No, I'm
right?
curious.
Again, Usually, like the speakers that people have on their laptops will suffice, and most newer systems have webcams. You can have only one connected monitor. Now, I find that irritating because I have screens open all the time. I have two monitors, basically, so I can write a lot. So having to disconnect one just for the LSAT would be aggravating to me. And then last, you need an internet connection because they're going to deliver the security and the whole platform actually over the internet to you. So that's what you actually need. So you've got to have a standard computer. You need a webcam, microphone, one monitor, and an internet connection. If you have that, you're good to go. If not, you're going to need to access it at some point or go to a friend's house and access it. They don't care where you do it as long as you have some control over your environment.
Yeah, I want to emphasize the computer part of this too, because one of the questions I've gotten a lot from people is like, dude, can I just do this on my iPad or my phone or something? And I don't know why you would want to type an entire essay on your phone in the first place. That sounds terrible. But as of now, this is tied to something, computer-based. It can be a laptop, it can be a desktop, but I don't think they're letting you do this on tablets and phones.
No, it doesn't look that way.
In fact, now.
I think what I'll do is I'll read the section that they've put up about this, because what happens is when you log in to take your writing sample, they're going to deliver a platform to you, and they're going to run you through a check-in and security protocol to make sure that, incredibly enough, you aren't getting assistance with your writing sample. And again, I think for the average student, people are like, yeah, as if. But in some instances, students might want someone nearby who's a really good writer or has, great command of the language to assist them. Yeah. And they want to stop that. They're very, very worried about security, as we've talked about previously.
Do you want to read the line from them? See if you can do it in like your best Orwell impression, because that's what this sounds like.
The Big Brother.
Oh, God.
Okay, so here's what they say about it. The secure proctoring platform uses input from the webcam, microphone, and screen of the candidate's own computer to ensure that the writing sample is the candidate's own work, and that the candidate is not receiving any inappropriate assistance. Maybe that's where the webcam comes in?
Must be.
I'm gonna leave that. Prior to the exam, candidates will complete a video check-in process. As part of that process, candidates will be required to display a government-issued ID to the camera and show their workspace to ensure that only permissible items are in that space. Both sides of any scratch paper must be shown, and the room will be scanned to make sure no other people are in the room. The proctoring software will automatically close any messaging, word processing, or web browsing applications before the exam begins and prevent such applications from being opened during the exam. Audio and video from every testing session will be reviewed by trained proctors.
There you go.
Okay, now first that was a great reading by me.
Orwell was British, so you failed.
Oh, so sorry.
Do it again.
You should have told me that you wanted a completely authentic reading. I went for Big Brother.
You did.
So,
that was a fine read, a bit like, chill-inducing. Yeah, every time I hear that, I'm just like, I cringe a little because it's so invasive.
Yeah, it's authoritarian. So they give you the proctoring software. It's its own platform. That's kind of annoying that you're going to have to download this. They say it's a separate browser, and it closes everything. So you got messaging, word processing, anything that you could use to communicate or look stuff up, that gets closed. You have to show certain things to the camera. You got to show your ID right to the camera because there's going to be a live proctor on the other end of that webcam who is looking at this.
Well, hang on.
You got scratch paper?
Let me ask you about this, the live proctor thing, because people have asked me, and I remain a little bit on the fence about how I think they'll do it. To have a live proctor available for every person at any time who logs in to do this thing seems a little aggressive, even unnecessary. What I suspect they might do, and maybe this is another bet that I'll win, what I suspect they might do is just automate the recording of it and then have it reviewable by people later on.
It would make some sense, although if you think about the amount of time that it takes to log somebody in, it's pretty quick. And notice that they say they want to scan the area. Apparently what they're going to ask is for people to either move their webcam or pick up their laptop and spin it around.
Yeah, so do a 360. Yeah.
That's not exactly the kind of scanning that is, machine is great from a machine standpoint. But it only takes a minute. I need to see your ID. Great. Can I see your scratch paper? Great. Can you just show me around the room real quick? Okay, looks good. Go ahead and start. On to the next person.
Right.
So every 30 minutes, they could probably check in 25 people.
If they do it based on that kind of regimen, maybe. But I mean, I'm a notorious vampire, basically. If I was going to do this thing, I'd probably write it at 3 a.m.
Sure, which means now that they have even less pressure because there's no one else writing it at 3 a.m. with you.
I mean, but is somebody available on their end at 3 like, at my beck and call, do they have proctor's staff?
That I can't tell you.
Yeah, that's why I'm a little bit dubious about them doing it that way. We'll see.
I would imagine they're going to have some type of global proctoring agency that handles this, who probably does business worldwide, and they will. They probably have put a 24/7 requirement on it, but we'll find that out when they release more information. So either way, they are scanning your information, what you're working with, and your environment before you start, just to make sure that it is all copacetic with them and their regulations. So that's fine with me. I don't actually have a real big problem with the way they're doing it, although it really feels like there's a degree of invasion here that we're looking at. Like, hi, we're LSAC and we're now in your home.
Yeah.
Words I don't ever really want to hear.
Right. Give me a bedroom tour. That's how this feels to me a little bit. Now spin.
Right back to the webcam again.
Yeah. Yeah, you bit your tongue off. I'll try. But I will say, again, for anyone who's kind of like, this is not a bad trade-off for what you get, which is, again, you can do it at your house. If you're not comfortable with somebody scanning your house via webcam and recording it, go to a friend's house, go to an office or a library. But this is a small price to pay, in my opinion.
And not to have to do it with, everybody else in the test day, and to only have to do it once.
Yeah.
There's a number of pros. And of course, to me, one of the biggest pros is the way their interface allows you to basically do common word processing functions.
Yeah, this is great.
Yeah, you have a spell checker.
Which I can't believe. GRE, GMAT, they don't do that.
I'm kind of stunned by it. But I like the emphasis on priorities there. Okay, these days spelling, I value it highly, but because we have spell checkers, it's not that big of a deal. You get to correct yourself. They're focusing on the ideas, not the little execution points. You can cut, copy, and paste text. So if you're like, I really like that, but it should be at the end, you can go ahead and move things around just like you could in Microsoft Word.
Sure.
And then also, especially from an accommodation standpoint, the writing sample works really well because it can go with big fonts. It can have line readers, so it reads it to you.
Yeah.
There's speech-to-text compatibility, so it's really good from an accommodation standpoint as well.
Yeah, for sure. There was a guy I saw an email earlier this week, you probably saw it too, who'd written us in, and he's like, I'm going to take the test in June, thank God, because I've broken both of my arms. I couldn't have written.
He was happy about breaking them?
Well, he was happy about having time to recover before he had to write anything. Because if you'd asked him to hold a pencil and write for a half hour, he was doomed.
Been the most interesting writing sample. Looked like a 3-year-old did it.
What is this? But he was another person who's obviously going to be an immediate beneficiary. And you mentioned the accessibility stuff too. That's just going to help scores of people perform better with this, or at least perform more representatively.
Yeah, and I think at this juncture, you can kind of look at the pros and cons of this compared to what the old format was, and it's a pretty quick summary. I mean, obviously, we just went through a few of them, things about its accommodations compliant. You can take it when you want, and so that shortens your test day. You only have to take it one time and never again. You've got these common tools like spell check and copy and paste. You're typing it, so it's highly legible. And most importantly, I think for many people, it's the same type of sample that it's always been. So you're not doing something new. They're not making a big change here. They're just changing the format, just like with the digital LSAT itself compared to old paper and pencil tests. Content's the same. The presentation is different. There are negatives, though. If you don't have a computer or you can't easily access one, then it starts to become a little bit of a hurdle. This separate browser installation and video check-in process, we've just talked about how Big Brother-ish it feels. And then, of course, you can't get your LSAT scored unless you have at least one completed writing sample. So you do have to get that done at some point. You can't just blow it off.
Let's focus a little bit, very briefly, on that last piece before we move on to talk some strategy, which is, to me, I think the most interesting part of this.
Yeah.
I've heard from some admissions people, like people actually involved in the process of selecting applicants. Concern is a strong word, but a little uncertainty about how this is going to play out in putting more of the responsibility on the applicant, as opposed to having LSAC and CAS and that deal with essentially the processing. Because it's possible you take the LSAT, you apply to law school, but if you don't actually sit down and complete this writing sample, they can't evaluate you.
It just sits there.
Their system will not have a complete application for you until this piece of it's done. So it's really now on applicants in a way that it never has been.
Yeah, you don't want to forget to go do your writing sample and then discover 5 months later, oh my gosh.
Why haven't I heard back from anybody?
None of my applications have been processed.
Right.
I'm still not completed. I think you'll see the effect maybe in, again, from a ranking standpoint, in the middle to lower ranked schools. If somebody's applying to a top 14 school, most people know that all things being equal, if you can apply earlier, it's better.
Right.
And so those top school applicants will get their applications completed. They'll make sure to complete the writing sample. I think it's maybe candidates who are applying for different schools who maybe aren't quite as motivated or maybe even informed about the nature of the law school admissions process.
Yeah, I think it's that latter that's going to be the bigger.
Yeah, they might linger a little bit and not realize the importance of completing it, and then later on discover, oh, I should have done it. So I know that you and I will certainly be on a campaign to inform people, like, get it done.
Yeah.
Get it done within, 3 to 5 days of taking your LSAT if you've never done a writing sample before. I'm sure you and I will both say that many, many times in the coming months. But that's, we can only reach 99% of the market. We can't reach everybody. And so there will always be a few people who aren't entirely certain whether or not, this is something they should do. So hopefully the word gets out, and law schools and LSAC need to be very vigilant about reminding people.
And vocal.
Do this. Get it done. You haven't done it.
Be loud. In fact, I hope that's how every LSAC for the foreseeable future, every LSAT concludes. I hope there's actually a thing built into the digital platform and that ends it. Like, remember, you are not done with this test.
It actually is, John. At the end of the test, when the test completes, a big scary clown face comes up and says, do your writing sample, and it flashes
some
back
jump
and
scare.
forth.
Yeah, it pops out. Writing sample. Yeah, that would be...
And it screams at you, too.
It's not the worst idea. Like that 5-minute warning, how intrusive and terrible it is.
Yeah, 5 minutes left. At the end, do your writing sample.
Scary clown. Yeah.
All right.
Dave, it's a wonder they don't just take all of our suggestions and immediately implement them.
They're all gold,
They're
John.
all so good.
Every one of them should be acted upon instantaneously by our friends in Newtown, Pennsylvania. It's interesting because we just spent a lot of time talking about the structure of it and how they're proctoring it and all these kinds of things. But we didn't really talk about what they ask you to do and how you're supposed to respond to that. And I think in this respect, we save the best for last because this is what interests you and I the most.
For sure.
So
yeah, we've told you that it's important to do a good job and the various reasons why this might matter for you. We haven't told you how to do a good job. And that's where
let's make sure we cover a little bit of that.
Yeah.
So the format of this is called the decision prompt. And that is because you have a decision to make. And so typically what happens is they will present you a scenario where somebody has a choice or a decision. They might be choosing office buildings, and one of them has, it's near the downtown, but it's more expensive. And the other one is further away in the suburbs, but it's cheaper. And they have different markets that they cater to. And they'll give you all these various pieces of information about each option. And as you consider those options, there's always 2 criterion that you have to keep in mind. And so they'll say, for example, that if you were choosing office buildings, that one of the things that you really want to emphasize is you want to reach the greatest number of people. And then you also want to have minimal costs. And oftentimes the criterion do not work well together. They sometimes can be conflicting, although it's usually not directly conflicting. And then each choice will often play towards various strengths and weaknesses of each. But the key thing is that there's no right answer to this. It's not as if you're like, oh, I'm taking the office building that is downtown. That's everybody's going to do that.
Right.
There's always some good and there's some bad to each. And so your task isn't to find the right answer, but your task is to choose the answer or the choice that you can defend the best.
Yeah, it's an interesting juxtaposition when you just compare it to the LSAT proper, right? You've just spent your entire day choosing the best thing, the objectively correct thing out of poorer competition. And then you come to a writing sample, and suddenly there is no correct choice to make. There's only how you defend the choice that you happen to make. This is really the only time on the LSAT that you get to argue in favor of your belief, and it matters. Yeah, and have it actually matter.
Yeah, usually what we think as test takers is relevant. And they set the right answer. Here it turns around. And I think their goal in making these writing samples is to get two options that are pretty close. Mm-hmm. They want it to be 50-50. It's not always that much parity. Sometimes it's like this one's 55%, the other one's 45%, but it's never like, oh, this one's so clearly right. So you get to put yourself in a position of making an argument that explains which choice that you have taken, mm-hmm. and also to a great extent explains why you didn't select the alternative choice. And so as we go through this, the approach that we use, we call the pro-con format, which is we're going to play up the pros of the choice that we've selected. We're going to downplay the negatives. We're going to acknowledge them,
right?
But we're going to downplay them because to ignore the weaknesses would be to leave ourselves open to attack, and we don't want to do that. So I'm going to be very clear about it. I'm going to say, this is the choice that I made. I really like these particular points, and I'll explain that and cite some facts from the information they've given us, and then I'll acknowledge the weaknesses, but I'll make sure that I don't play them up. I'll play them down.
Yeah.
And then I'll do the reverse with the option that I did not select. I'll be like, I didn't like these negatives.
Emphasize the cons, downplay the pros. Let me double down on something you just said that, because I really want to make sure this is as clear as it can be. You do have to pick a choice. There are two choices here that are largely equal. You got to take one. Which, again, to me, runs, at least in part, counter to what this test is about and what lawyerdom is about, which is finding a happy middle ground a lot of times, or at least living in the most defensible position. And the most defensible position, when there's not a clear right answer, is not to take a side.
Or to take parts of both.
But to live in some degree of agnosticism, call it. This is not that.
You can't do it.
No, you have to commit to one.
In fact, what we always tell people is you have to be extremely careful to avoid any kind of gimmick, number one.
We'll talk about that because that's my
compromise.
My
Like, you can't come in and be like, each of these options has strengths, and therefore what I've chosen to do is to offer a third route for this decision, which is to get an office building that is close to downtown but not immediately inside of downtown.
That's right.
And then this will hit all the points. You can't do that. You can't make up a third option. And in fact, if you do so, I once talked to a dean about this, and he was like, yeah, at that point, you're proving to me that you can't actually argue for a position. And of course, it's never this dramatic. But now what happens when, your client has done these things? You can't argue yourself out of them. Well, they really didn't murder that.
Yeah, I know he's on trial for murder, but he didn't rob that bank.
Yeah.
Thanks.
We understand that. This kind of thing, you need to take a position. That's what the expectation is. Anybody who is reading these understands what the task at hand is. And if they see that you have avoided it, they all of a sudden will, I'm not going to say it's a black mark, but it's certainly not a positive. Of course.
And it's unnecessary, thankfully. Like, it just follow the rules.
It is follow the rules. Now, inside the rules, though, there is this option that people see, and they think to themselves, you know what? I'm not going to be like everybody else. I'm going to be creative, and I'm going to show them that I'm not the average candidate. I'm not just going to choose a side. I'm going to present it in a special wrapper that is going to make me stand out. So, for example, they might say, well, this company, I'm actually an executive for this company, and as we make this choice, I have some inside information that tilts me towards the suburban option. Or
Yeah.
as
As a
a
guy who's
friend of
lived in the suburbs of this city for 14 years, I can tell you the commute's
yeah.
not as bad as it says here. Come
Yeah,
on.
or as a friend of the mayor,
Right.
we've been strongly urging them to don't do that. All right. It sounds appealing and you're like, that'll make it more fun. Yes, it would. But this task is not designed to be fun. This task is designed to see whether or not you have a certain ability. Play to the ability. Don't play games. Don't come up with some kind of literary trick or gimmick
Yeah.
that you think is going to be catchy, because it will not be catchy. This is not the place for humor. It's not the place for creativity of that sort. This is the place for actually writing as best you can a legal brief that says this is the best option and here's why.
It's meant to be dry. This is not your time to, again, show off some sort of like weird avant-garde nuanced thing. I've seen people be like, this is my chance to show them I speak French, and they'll write the essay in French. You idiot. No.
Don't do that.
No. Or I've got this haiku that's perfect for this moment. Like, no, don't. Save your poetry.
Yeah, obviously, since we know a whole ton of people that take the LSAT with some frequency, I've seen people write things to the extent of, quite clearly the downtown office building is the best choice. I can't believe we're discussing this. Yeah. Now, if you're not applying to law school, you could get away with that. For everybody else, don't do that.
Yeah, be diplomatic, as I often tell people. Like, if you commit yourself so strongly to one side versus the other, you've really ignored the fact that these are meant to be largely competitive options.
I think that's actually a really good point when you say diplomatic, because sometimes people want to get into this very antagonistic, what they almost think of as like a lawyer situation, where they're like, I'm defending my guy to the death and I'm attacking the other person to the death. And so they'll say, the option I've chosen is by far superior. It has, there are hardly any weaknesses, and the other option is terrible. Now, to an impartial observer, is that going to ring true? Of course not, because again, every one of the options has good things and bad things about it.
Right.
So you have to be diplomatic. I don't think that's a point that can be or overemphasized.
Right. Yeah, imagine you're in a debate with someone and you're trying to win the debate. Neither of you have a perfect position, but you have equal evidence. How are you going to win that debate? Not by taking such a hardline stance and calling the other person stupid or dismissing them outright. You're going to do it with nuance and subtlety and small degrees of emphasis in the right place.
Reason.
Yeah. And that's all this is show why the fact that your choice has got pros and they're slightly better, perhaps, than the benefits of the choice you didn't take. Your cons are not quite as problematic as the cons of the other. But if you can acknowledge all four of those pieces, the good and bad of both, it makes you look really well-reasoned. It makes you look very measured and moderate, which is all, I think, a good thing to strive for.
And that means that the language that you end up using is going to sound very reasonable.
Hopefully.
You're going to talk about, like, I believe this is a superior choice, not that it's the only choice or that the other choice is terrible.
As any fool can see. Don't do that.
Yeah. The benefits outweigh these kinds of phrasings. But usually the paragraph format is almost a simple 2, occasionally 3 paragraph format, where in the first paragraph, you're just talking a lot about the pros of your choice, and come out clearly, I believe this is the superior option, and then start breaking it down. And you close usually by acknowledging some of the weaknesses, but by pointing out that they are outweighed by other things that are positive. And then you reverse it in that second paragraph. And at the end, you just restate that conclusion, for the reasons above.
Sure. So if you were to add a third paragraph, your third paragraph would probably be 1, maybe 2 sentences of just a
summary.
Encompassment, yeah. What I recommend is usually 2 paragraphs, maybe a third if you want to conclude it. And there's 2 ways that I see you do it as almost a template, where you can break the paragraphs into pros and cons. You talk about the advantages of both, but how yours outweigh, and then the cons of both and how yours aren't as bad. Or you can break the 2 paragraphs into choice 1 and choice 2. Here's what I picked. Here's what's good about it. Here's what's bad about it, but not that big a deal. Choice 2, here's what I didn't choose. Here are the issues with it. Yeah, it has these benefits, but that's the other way that you can do it. But
I've always preferred the latter format myself.
Yeah, and that's usually where I go. Sometimes I take creative license, as it were, and maybe we'll mix it up.
Yeah, I think if you've done more than one, then you get the opportunity to do that. But the one thing that is really important about this is your setup. Because you can talk about writing the essay and the form that you should use, but keep in mind that the very first thing you do when you read these is you're analyzing it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as if you just pick up, in this case, the keyboard and start typing. What's really happening is this is why they give you scratch paper, and why they want to see the scratch paper. We usually make a big grid with the pros and cons for each, and we'll make some quick notes like, all right, I like this, I dislike that, and then do that for both options.
Right. Cartesian plane style, really, with like an X and Y axis, pros and cons, option 1, option 2, and then you've got 4 places to write this stuff out.
Exactly. Each quadrant covers a different part of what you're looking at. And then as I go through, I'll just check them off. Mm-hmm. All right, let's talk about these pros. And then, I've prioritized them. I think that's the biggest one. That's the second. And I'm just checking them off. Then I'm checking the cons off. Then I'm doing it for the other option. So don't think that you're just going to start typing instantly. You're going to read, analyze, make some notes. That's going to be like the first 5 to 7 minutes.
For sure.
Then you're writing for a while, probably about 23 to 25 minutes. And again, these are not hardline guidelines that we're saying that you have to follow. After 23 minutes, stop. That's not how it works. And then the last several minutes, you're just rereading and correcting. It's easier to correct now. You want to make sure that you give it a nice read through, that you didn't miss a word or you haven't misspelled something accidentally. Right. And at that point, you get to the end of the time. You should be good. Time runs out. It submits the essay. You're done.
Yeah, in defending your position or perhaps denying the other, one of the other questions, Dave, that you've probably gotten as well is, like, do I need to do this factually? What kind or degree of assumptions am I allowed to make here? So, for instance, if it's some hypothetical city, can I add statistics about it? Can I make up facts? The city's population has grown by 8%, blah, blah. Can I do that sort of thing? Or is it better to just stick entirely within the details that the prompt provides?
Should you make up facts in court?
Me?
Should anybody?
That's the only reason I'm not in jail right now. Because I'm quick on my feet.
Back to reality.
No. I think it's a bad idea to try to include details that you've invented, frankly.
They'll stand out as not
where'd that come
from?
Where do you get this number of unemployment's at 6%?
8%, population growth. And that kind of advice is given within the context of don't make up stuff that doesn't exist. But if there are things that are clearly known, such as the fact that being by a population center typically is going to drive more traffic to a business, things that they would say are common sense assumptions are completely fine for you to go ahead and reference. Things like supply and demand, everybody understands how those things work, and you talking about them in an essay that deals with economics or business or what have you, completely acceptable and normal.
A lot of this is through the lens of economic principles as well, as you would expect certain decisions to be. So it's fine to trade off of the fundamentals of how decisions get made, but you don't need to supplement this with random facts that you've created.
Now, they've given you enough information, enough pros and cons on each. It's all about execution and presenting your viewpoint. Your goal is to develop a viewpoint, support it, and as well as you can, prove it, and understand that there is no right or wrong answer at the end of the day.
While realizing it's unprovable.
Yeah, you can't truly prove it because there will always be counter arguments. However, you want to be able to have someone walk away saying, that was well written. And hopefully well reasoned as well. But if you sound good, you are probably 80% of the way through. And then if you can add some good, solid reasoning to it, you're going to end up with a writing sample that does exactly what you want it to do, which is to get you past any kind of scrutiny.
Perfect.
And keep you in the ball game in terms of admissions.
Can't say it better than that.
And then I think we're done. All right. Well, that is our discussion of the writing sample, and hopefully you will only take it once in your lifetime and you'll never, ever have to take it again. So I want to thank everybody for listening today. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube, and give us a rating if you don't mind. And if you have any questions, you can send those to lsat@powerscore.com or lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. And on behalf of Jon and myself, thanks so much for listening. Have a great week.